I'm Venetia Rainey.
And I'm Arthur Scott Geddes.
And this is Battle Lines Global Health Security. It's Wednesday, 5th of November 2025.
In Ukraine, tens of thousands of soldiers have returned home from the front lines missing limbs. Many of them will require support for the rest of their lives.
But not all of those amputations are down to direct hits on the battlefield. Ukraine's chief military surgeon has said that up to 1 in 4 of those amputations are down to improper use of tourniquets.
So today we're asking, have combat medics become over-reliant on the tourniquet? And what does this enormous burden of injury mean for Ukraine in the long term?
Well, I've seen, a large number of very high amputations, often bilateral, in young men who are otherwise healthy.
We're joined now by Chaloner, a reporter from the Telegraph's Global Health Security Desk who first broke the story that improper tourniquet use in Ukraine was creating a wave of unnecessary amputations. Maeve, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Maeve, how big is the issue of amputees on Ukraine's frontline?
There's currently no nationwide trauma database in Ukraine. There's several reasons for that. Firstly, it's quite an outdated medical system. A lot of the records are kept on paper, and so there's no sort of centralised database which has the exact figures. So we don't exactly know. Estimates hugely vary. Kind of medium estimate is about 40,000 soldiers have suffered amputations since the full-scale invasion in February 2022. Others put that number as high as 100,000. So it's unclear at the moment, but I mean, it's a very significant number.
How do tourniquets come into it? Why are they causing unnecessary amputations? Just explain that to us.
So a tourniquet is essentially a very tight band that's placed onto a limb that's been injured. So, for example, if a soldier has stepped onto an IED or if they've been shot and they're having severe bleeding, the band is essentially applied onto the wound and then it's tightened with a sort of wrench and it stops blood flow completely. So say you're losing a significant amount of blood, you put the tourniquet on, that blood loss will completely stop. That's an incredible invention. It's been used for more than 100 years in different war zones around the world. But the problem is, if it's left on for more than 2 hours, it causes complete tissue death. And so essentially, if it's put on for more than 2 hours, your limb will essentially die and it will need to be amputated. Now, in war zones like Iraq and Afghanistan, where tourniquets were used pretty ubiquitously by Western forces, that was fine because the Western armies had control of the skies. They could evacuate their servicemen within an hour to a hospital, Camp Bastion, for example. Now, in Ukraine, because of the skies are crawling with drones, soldiers are evacuated by car or by train, which can take several hours or even days. So if a tourniquet is placed on and it's not taken off quickly, within that 2-hour period, then a soldier will get to hospital and they will almost definitely have to have their limb amputated. Now, if there's a situation where that soldier was going to die, that's obviously worth it. There's a phrase in military medicine, life over limb. However, the problem is, in Ukraine, because it's there are so many conscripts and people who aren't very experienced soldiers, they panic, they see a wound, they don't have the training to know whether or not that requires a tourniquet. It could be stopped by another method like a pressure bandage or just with sort of physical pressure with someone's hands, for example. They'll panic. They use a tourniquet because they have a tourniquet in their military kit. They put it on and then same situation, the soldier gets evacuated and might not have needed one in the first place, then has to have their limb amputated because the evacuation has taken such a long time.
So Maeve, how did this story come about?
Captain Rom Stevens, who you're going to hear from shortly, he is a retired US Navy doctor who volunteers regularly in Ukraine. And he and some of his colleagues who he's working with in Ukraine, Ukrainian trauma surgeons, released an academic paper last year on the potential misuse of tourniquets, which I came across in my research and then spoke to and sort of realised the scale of the problem.
Okay, let's hear some of your conversation with Captain Stevens.
Captain Stevens, welcome to Battle Lines. You worked on the guidelines for tourniquet use developed by the US military, something that has saved many thousands of soldiers' lives around the world. But you also believe that same advice is causing thousands of unnecessary amputations in Ukraine. Can you describe what you've seen?
Well, I've seen, a large number of very high amputations, often bilateral, in young men who are otherwise healthy.
And bilateral being both legs or both arms?
Both legs, yeah. And sometimes both arms. And very high amputations, which means that it's very difficult. There's not much muscle there left to fit a prosthesis. And so oftentimes you can't fit a prosthesis because the amputations are so high. And, I've talked to hundreds of Ukrainian doctors and nurses, and they're, their hearts are broken for these young patients who are in the prime of their lives and have lost, two limbs and are disabled for life.
Could you explain the basic use of a tourniquet in the battlefield?
In Korea and Vietnam, an analysis of battlefield deaths showed that the most common cause of preventable battlefield deaths was hemorrhage, particularly from limb hemorrhage. And therefore, tourniquets were reintroduced into the American military system in the late 1990s, early 2000s, right about the time of the 2003 invasion into Iraq. Not all wounds require a tourniquet, and the basic training, military medic training, is to examine the wound, to cut off the uniform and examine the wound and see where the blood is coming from and see if it's venous blood or arterial blood, and to try to stop the blood using a variety of methods, including direct pressure and pressure bandages. And a tourniquet can be used if there is life-threatening hemorrhage resulting in shock, or may result in shock.
What's gone so wrong with the use of tourniquets in Ukraine? Why do we find ourselves in this situation?
When the full-scale Russian invasion occurred in 2022, all the American Tactical Combat Casualty Care, or TCCC, guidelines were translated into Ukrainian, but they were written for a different war. Tourniquets were often placed in the Ukrainian forces not by trained medics or by medical officers, but by other soldiers. And often these soldiers had very little or maybe no medical training because they were rushed into uniform at the beginning of the war. Ukrainians were fighting for their existence, and this is certainly understandable. The TCCC guidelines mandate that within an hour or certainly 2 hours, the tourniquets need to be reevaluated and taken down. It's called tourniquet conversion, and replaced with a pressure bandage, because in many cases a tourniquet is not necessary to stop the bleeding, and a pressure bandage might be perfectly adequate. But in Ukraine, the soldiers who are poorly trained in medicine are afraid to take down the tourniquets. And their number of trained paramedics, combat paramedics, are small, and they also have, relative to our forces, very short training. And I believe that because of the deficit of trained combat medics, they're probably not getting good refresher training.
How long is too long to leave a tourniquet on?
There have been many studies showing that 2 hours is safe. After that, it becomes unsafe. And probably somewhere around between 4 and 6 hours, if a tourniquet is left on that long, the limb becomes unsalvageable, because muscles, nerves, and vessels start to die. Vessels clot off, muscles start to become necrotic, break down. Compartment syndrome occurs, which is an increase in pressure in the compartments in the extremities, which result in further nerve damage. And somewhere between 4 and 6 hours, it becomes too late to save the leg or the arm. And almost always after 6 hours, an amputation is necessary.
If you can't get an injured soldier out of the battlefield in time, like in the Ukrainian context, what do you do in that situation? Do you not use a tourniquet at all?
I think there's 3 situations where you should use a tourniquet. And I want to make it clear that I'm not advocating that we get rid of tourniquets entirely. The first situation is when you have a traumatic amputation. So when the limb is gone, there's nothing there to save. You need a tourniquet to prevent fatal hemorrhage, fatal bleeding. But in that case, the tourniquet should be placed as close to the stump as possible, so that as much of the leg is preserved to be able to fit a prosthesis later on.
The traumatic amputation, that's a landmine or something of that nature?
Yes, that's what we saw in southern Afghanistan very frequently when infantrymen would step on an IED, improvised explosive device, a landmine, and both legs would be blown away. So that's a traumatic amputation. Another scenario is when the limb is hopelessly mangled and cannot be salvaged. Now that requires some judgment, some medical judgment that a Ukrainian soldier would not have, and maybe even not a Ukrainian paramedic. And the third scenario where a tourniquet is necessary, in my view, is when nothing else works to stop life-threatening hemorrhage. So when you've tried pressure bandages, you've tried direct pressure, you've tried ligation if you can, ligate the vessel, and nothing else works to save the life of the patient, then I think a tourniquet is reasonable. But given the fact that when tourniquets are placed on the battlefield in Ukraine, they almost always result in an amputation because of long evacuation times, the tourniquet should really be only a last resort.
How many people do you think have been affected by this misuse of tourniquets?
There is no solid data. Any estimates are just that. So, for example, in February of 2024, the Ukrainian Minister of Health, Dr. Lyashko, was quoted as saying at that point there had been something like 100,000 amputations. He said since the full-scale invasion, there had been 100,000 in 2 years. So if you project that, estimate about 50,000 amputations a year, we're almost now 4 years into this conflict. So that's, maybe somewhere around 200,000 amputations. And recently, the chief surgeon of Ukrainian forces, Colonel Humaniuk, said that 25 to 30% of the amputations had been caused by tourniquets. So 30% of 200,000 is 60,000. So I think that's a reasonable guess, but it's only a guess. And I think it's pretty clear that the number is very large and it's in the several tens of thousands. So whether it's 40,000, 50,000, 60,000, 70,000, I think that's not the point. The point, because one is too many. I think the point is that there's a very large number. And this will burden the Ukrainian society for 1 or 2 generations to come.
That was Captain Rom Stevens. Maeve, this story got a really strong reaction, didn't it? Can you tell us a bit about that? Why were people so angry?
So a few days after we published this story, there was a Facebook post that was widely circulated, posted by the Command of the Medical Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, who is essentially the top doctor in Ukraine's military. And he did a post saying that, and I'll just quote from this here, "This information is not true and harms the activities of the Armed Forces of Ukraine." And I think that sort of the way it's phrased is pretty indicative of why people were so angry. Essentially, it's, if you're the head of an army, you don't want to be culpable for potentially thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of unnecessary amputations of your servicemen. It's bad for morale. And essentially, it's not a good look if the Russian military are seeing that as well. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think the other reason is that, what's the solution here? I mean, you can say, okay, we're misusing tourniquets, but what's the alternative? That's going to take a lot of revision and work within the Ukrainian military. And, they're in a full-scale war at the moment. They don't necessarily have the resources or the capability to revise their guidelines. So, I think it's a multifaceted issue, but you can sort of understand where that controversy comes from.
So actually, a bit later on, we're going to be speaking to someone about some of the longer-term implications of this and also a little bit about the sensitivities of this issue. Thank you very much for joining us on Battle Lines.
Thank you.
It was so interesting chatting to Maeve because I really didn't realise just how sensitive this issue was in Ukraine, and it also brought home to me that the scale of this problem means it won't just be a wartime issue, right? It's going to haunt the country for generations to come. Some even argue that veterans, if they're treated badly, that will have political and security implications.
That's right. So one of those people is Eddie Chaloner. He's a former surgeon who worked as an army medic in Rwanda, Bosnia and Kosovo. And he actually recently wrote a piece for us arguing that Ukraine as a nation will be defined by how it treats its war wounded.
Eddie, welcome to Battle Lines Global Health Security.
Oh, many thanks for asking me.
This piece that you wrote for us was fascinating. It took a really interesting look at what it says about a state in the way that they treat their war veterans. And you were thinking specifically about Ukraine, and you were contrasting it with Russia as well, which I thought was fascinating. Just can you explain that idea a bit for us? Why is that telling, and what are the challenges involved?
This is an existential war for the nation of Ukraine, as it's defined currently. And it's a war being fought by the whole of society. So it's a citizens' war. It's not a professional army war. We in the West have been used to sort of outsourcing war, if you like, to professionals ever since Gulf War One. War is something that's happened somewhere else, done by the professionals. It's a bit like a thunderstorm. It's inconvenient, but it doesn't really disrupt civil society. Everybody in Ukraine has been affected by this conflict and will continue to be affected by it for decades to come. Economically, psychologically, socially, and all the rest of it. Many of the soldiers currently fighting for Ukraine are conscripts. They've been ordered by the state to report for duty and put themselves in harm's way to protect the notion of Ukraine as a sovereign nation. So when citizens agree to undertake that, part of the deal, the contract, if you like, the unwritten contract, is that the state will look after them should they come to grief, whether that's their psychological health or their physical health. If that contract is broken, that becomes a bit of a problem, right? You can readily understand that. And we know from history that in previous conflicts, let's take the First World War, the disabled servicemen as a political lobby group were very powerful after the First World War, very influential, quite reasonably, and exerted a fair amount of political pressure to lobby for rehabilitation services and to a wider extent social change in Britain, which did happen. And I don't see any reason why it would be different this time.
So we talked briefly about Russia. They possibly have a different strategy for dealing with their wounded soldiers. Can you see any sort of negative after effects of that coming down the line for them?
Well, the first thing to say is obviously it's very difficult to get reliable information, and that's partly because the nature of the Russian state is that they won't disclose information. I don't think that's unreasonable. If we were in a similar situation, we would do the same. And the information environment in their system is quite tightly managed. They don't really have a free press like we do. That said, it's a reasonable assumption that they have a similar burden of disabled servicemen as a consequence of this conflict. One, again, potential mirror from history might be considered their experience in Afghanistan, where the Afghansi, as they were called, the Afghan veterans, were quite a powerful force for political change in the former Soviet Union. And they, as a political pressure group, were by no means the cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but they were one of the causes of resentment and discontent, which played into that process of political and social change. Now, I'm not in any way qualified to comment on whether or not the current veterans or disabled cohort from the Ukraine conflict are going to have anything like the same influence within Russia. But that said, if they have a burden of disabled servicemen on the same proportion as Ukraine, if inevitably that becomes visible, even in an authoritarian system.
What does successful rehabilitation look like then of amputees?
Well, the end state is to restore people to normal social and economic functioning, or as close as you can get to it. Again, we know from studies in other conflicts that failure to rehabilitate wounded and disabled servicemen leads to the inevitable consequences of depression, loss of sort of social status, unemployment, substance abuse, and so on and so forth. The aim of the game, the end state, desired end state, is to get people back in the workforce so that they retain their purpose in life, really.
And does that need to start now, or is that something that we start planning for now once the conflict is over, whenever that is?
Well, I'm pleased to say it's already well underway, and even more delighted to say that the British Army has had something to do with that. We have a programme running supported by the British Army in Western Ukraine, which again is open source, it's all known about.
Doing what exactly?
Well, providing help to the Ukrainians so that they can do it themselves, basically.
Fitting prosthetics, physio, what sorts of things?
Yeah,
or
supporting those processes using the knowledge gained from our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Headley Court Rehabilitation Centre.
What are some of the challenges that Ukraine are facing that is unique to this conflict?
Well, I think first of all you've got to say the volume of patients. It's very difficult to be sure exactly how many amputees there are as a consequence of this conflict, and there are many reasons for that. Not the least being that it's kind of politically and militarily sensitive. So it's really difficult to get a handle on exactly how many amputees there are. Having looked through the literature, a reasonable median estimate would be about 40,000, and that's significant because strangely it's about the same number of amputees there were in Britain after the First World War, when the populations were broadly similar. The population of Ukraine before the First World War, before this conflict, was about 40 million. The population of the UK in 1914 was 40 million. So it's roughly comparable. Now, it's important to say, when people say the Ukraine conflict is like the First World War, it does have some similarities, but it's not the same as the First World War. So in the First World War, there are a lot more than 40,000 amputation operations done, but a lot of those people died, whereas that's different with Ukraine. Most of them would survive amputation. But that's a hell of a lot of people, right, in comparison to the total population. And furthermore, it's also mostly economically active males, and that has a knock-on effect because a lot of them have been prior breadwinners for their families and all the rest of it. So it's important to appreciate a wounded soldier is not just one wounded soldier. That's a wounded family, right? And that's the sociological, political importance of it, and the importance of restoring those people back to health and economic well-being, because that will ultimately have a bearing on how the country recovers.
what is at stake for Ukraine if it gets this wrong?
Prior to the conflict, it would be wrong to think of Ukraine as a standard Western European nation. It was well known that there was a high level of corruption. They were in the process of working their way towards the European model. But there was plenty of people within Ukraine who contested that and indeed were more comfortable with the model similar to that in Russia or the Soviet Union. So my understanding of it is it would be an error to think of Ukraine as a completely cohesive society. That said, if the rehabilitation of the wounded is done successfully, then I would expect it to contribute towards the country starting to move to a more European style social democracy. If it fails, on the other hand, well, you can probably expect a completely different outcome. So I think there's quite a lot at stake in this.
Eddie Chaloner, thank you very much for joining us on Battlelines Global Health Security.
Very kind of you to ask me. Thank you.
That was Eddie Chaloner, former military medic and retired surgeon. That's all for us today on this episode of Battlelines Global Health Security. We'll be back again next week on Wednesday. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.